Far away, thank you. General Hospital.
Do you know which ward?
X-ray, thank you.
General.
General Hospital. Physiotherapy, thank you. General Hospital. General Hospital.
General Hospital. General.
In its 200-year history, the General Hospital has saved countless lives, and though its founders wouldn't recognise the space-age treatment offered today, the actual building they provided to serve the lame, sick and poor of the 18th century still stands, hidden in the clutter of buildings that grew around it. But the General's unlikely to go on growing. In fact, the hospital will almost certainly shrink in size and importance. But whatever its future may be, the principles established by the founders haven't changed.
Gentlemen, I am come here at the request of the Committee of the General Hospital to lay the foundation stone of that charitable institution. I am well satisfied that it will be of considerable advantage to many sick and lame poor in present and future ages. When I consider the noble benefactions and generous subscriptions which have been presented, it offers a pleasing prospect of its being preserved to posterity.
The foundation stone of the General was laid on February the 12th, 1781, by a Mr. John Smellie, the Mayor of Nottingham, who in his speech gave due credit to the banker John Key, whose legacy of £500 had spurred local businessmen into financing the project. And by July 1782, everything was ready for the opening ceremony, a dignified occasion with a procession of officials who had quite a long walk from the hospital, which was just outside the town on the edge of the park, to St. Mary's Church for the dedication. It was appropriate that the hospital opened to the sound of hymn singing, for in those days one thanked God rather than the primitive treatments of the day if you were fortunate enough to survive a major illness. Indeed, hospital was a last resort.
I think anybody moving from today's hospitals to 1781 wouldn't even recognise the style of what was going on, because at that time, if you had any sort of financial means at all, you were ill, you died, and you'd been born at home.
Professor Tony Mitchell is the longest-serving doctor at the General today, but his interest in the place goes back further than his career. He's written a history of the hospital, which paints a vivid picture of the General's early years.
The only people who were in hospitals, as they were known at that time, were the very poor and the people in the army and the navy. And to get into such a hospital, it was really the poverty that you had to prove rather than the nature of your illness. And the reason for that was that medicine and surgery had so little to offer to the illnesses of the day. Treatments, as we would now know them, hadn't come into being, so it was in essence creature comforts, food, warmth and shelter that were being offered by the hospitals of the day, and in my view the inhabitants of the early General Hospital might feel more at home in a 20th century prison than they would in a 20th century hospital.
But there was a difference. It was all too easy to get into prison in those days, and much harder to be admitted to hospital.
They had to bring with them to the hospital a letter of recommendation from somebody who actually paid into the funds of the hospital. And everybody who was a subscriber had the ability to recommend so many people as inpatients and so many people as outpatients each year. And the first thing that happened was that he was what we would now call means tested, and so the weekly board examined him or her very stringently to make sure he was what they called a proper object of charity or in real distress.
The patients shall be admitted and discharged every Tuesday by the committee between the hours of 11 and 1 o'clock. Every person who is admitted must not fail to bring at least 2 shirts or 2 shifts, and a short statement of their case. No persons shall be admitted who are able to subsist themselves or pay for their cure. In the case of death, the person who recommended the deceased must either remove the corpse or defray the burial expenses, which will be reduced to as small a sum as decency will permit.
It was the rules that made me compare it with present-day prisons, because the people were locked up at night, so that they couldn't wander and stray. They were looked after at night, not by the nurses that we would find in present-day hospitals, but by people called watchers, who were hired from the women in the town at a few pence per night. Matron kept the keys, and she locked them all in at 8 o'clock at night.
No inpatient shall sit up after 8 o'clock in the winter, nor after 9 in the summer, unless the matron should on any particular occasion direct otherwise, and everyone, unless such as are ordered to the contrary by the physicians and surgeon, shall rise by 7 in the summer and by 8 in the winter. There shall be no swearing, no cards, nor smoke, nor spirits on the premises. Such inpatients as are able shall be employed to assist in nursing the other patients, and in washing and ironing the linen, cleaning the wards, and such other service as the matron shall require.
The folk were shut off from the ordinary society, and people were sacked for allowing patients to smuggle in provisions. They were sacked for allowing the inmates to converse with people in the town streets.
Isolated from the rest of the town in almost rural surroundings, the hospital had to become a self-sufficient community.
They had livestock. The meat came from their own pigs in their own piggery, and some of the wards had occasion to complain because of the smells that wafted up from the pigsty. And the pigs were looked after by the porter, who was a very important person in the early hospital. They had a garden, and in the garden they grew the herbs, from which came things to put in baths to make people smell sweeter, and of course some of the very simple treatments which were available at that time. And the patients were expected to contribute their share in sweeping, washing, cleaning. The male patients were expected to help to look after the other male patients and to do some of the very simple treatments under the supervision of a man called the apothecary, who we would now call the resident medical officer.
And the patients were probably no worse off looking after each other than when they were in the hands of the professionals, because it seems the nurses in those days were far from angels of mercy.
I think anybody who's read the early struggles of Florence Nightingale to nurse and to be recognised as a nurse will realise that the image of nursing is completely different from the way we would recognise it at the minute. The caricatures of the drunken nurse, the Sarah Gamp sort of person, barely distinguishable from the loose women of the towns of the day, led families to try and prevent their daughters from entering nursing. The matron wasn't a nurse as we would recognise her at the present time. She was expected to be able to keep the household accounts, to run the economy of the building, and she was given interesting tasks like having the custody of the teaspoons, tablespoons and simple cutlery which the hospital possessed in those days. The nurses were involved in very little treatment because very little treatment was available. The physicians of the day set great store, as we still do, by the patient's description of the way that the illness had started, the things that patients notice, which of course we call the symptoms of disease. Then they gradually became more and more skilled at looking at things, listening to things, and feeling things, the manual skills of medicine. And it's hard to imagine what the task of the physicians and the surgeons of the day must have been, deprived of all the simple tools, x-rays, laboratory tests, stethoscopes, all the things that we take for granted. And some of the things that they did we would regard as rather horrific now, but at least it gave a clue to disease. Patients who passed a lot of urine and who lost weight were known to have something sweet in their urine, which is why the disease diabetes, which means passing a lot of water, and mellitus, which means sweet, why those words were coined. How did they know it was sweet? They tasted it.
So, having established what a patient was suffering from by whatever distasteful means, there was still the problem of treatment.
What all of them were doing were really applying some physical treatments to the patients of the day. They would take large quantities of blood from the veins at the bend of the elbow, bleeding. They would scratch the surface of the skin and then put hot cups on it to draw the fluid out of the part that they believed to be diseased, cupping. They would get a leech out of a bottle and put it onto the part that was diseased in order to draw the bad blood out. And of course these were tasks that were done by the doctors themselves, and the nurses of the day had very little contribution to make to what we would now recognise as the nursing skills. They were cleaning, they were sweeping, they were dishing out the meals, and they were supervised by people who visited the wards and asked the patients whether the nurses had done their job properly.
The hospital is to be visited by the house visitors once every day for the week after their appointment, when they are to walk through the wards with white wands, that they may be known to be house visitors. And as soon as they enter the wards, the nurses are to withdraw, and the patients to stand by the sides of their respective beds. They shall then inquire whether the apothecary, the matron, the nurses, and the servant have behaved agreeable to the rules of the hospital.
The staff had to leave the ward so that the visitors could then ask the patients in private whether they had been fed, bathed and dealt with during the previous week. Indeed, people were sacked because patients in a ward hadn't had a wash or a bath for over 2 weeks. Other people were sacked because they had smuggled provisions in from outside. And so it was a very different atmosphere. The nurses were nearer to domestic servants. The medical staff had very little to offer in the way of effective treatment, but above all, the hospital offered warmth and security to people whose lot out in the town slums would have been much more abysmal.
And conditions in those slums grew worse during the 19th century, which brought a flood of industrial workers to the city. Many of them were poor, but not destitute. Their wages earned in the dangerous factory environments where mechanisation was increasing production, but also increasing the number of accidents that the General had to deal with. So much so that more and more of its work was dealing with emergency cases, people who couldn't wait till Tuesday to be admitted. Fortunately, though, by this time, medical knowledge was beginning to make great strides, not only in surgery, but in what's now known as preventative medicine. The slums were a breeding ground for disease, but by the middle of the century, doctors were quick to seize on the latest methods of stopping its spread.
The great mortality that has prevailed among the children of the poor from the smallpox in the town of Nottingham this winter has induced the medical gentlemen to give their consent to a plan proposed for the inoculation of the children of the town and its neighbourhood. Notice is therefore given that such poor who wish to avail themselves of the opportunity now offered must apply at the hospital on Tuesday mornings of April and September of this year.
It was Edward Jenner who discovered that a dose of the mild cowpox was protection against the deadly smallpox. This discovery of vaccination was a lifesaver, but the public was suspicious, and it was the cow connection that was the problem. Cartoons of the day show people growing horns and tails as an unlikely side effect of vaccination, but the General pressed on with its vaccination programme.
A man called Attenborough, who was one of the founding surgeons of the General Hospital, was quick to bring this technique to Nottingham, but he suffered the same criticism and derision that Jenner himself had done, because this was thought to be so unnatural. The next thing was that it was realised that many other diseases, which could not be vaccinated against at that time, were being transmitted by the foul conditions in which many of the citizens of Nottingham lived. Nottingham had some of the worst slums in the British Empire, excepting Calcutta, and people were drinking water which was contaminated with sewage percolating through the soil, and so the General Hospital was filled with what were called enteric fevers, and there were hundreds of cases each year. There were many deaths. And then, after the 1914-18 war, the city of Nottingham decided to get rid of the old insanitary earth closets and pale privies and to install what we now take for granted, which is water carriage or water closets, to take away the sewage and keep it separate from the water supply. And so something that the city of Nottingham did, not the doctors, not the hospitals, not the individuals themselves, dramatically reduced the admissions to the General Hospital for enteric fevers, and now we would be absolutely amazed to discover a case of enteric fever in Nottingham, and we would suspect that it was some traveller to less sanitary places that had picked it up on a foreign tour.
Although it was the work of water engineers that eventually improved the state of public health in Nottingham, the doctors can at least take credit for the advances in surgery that were made in the 19th century, the most important development being the introduction of anaesthetics in the 1850s. Before that, surgery was a much more barbaric business.
All you could do to dull the pain of an operation was to give large quantities of alcohol to the person and just work your way through the screams that they would inevitably make. the surgery until about 1850 had to be quick, rather brutal, and therefore the great skill that present-day surgeons need couldn't be developed. It was speed that was the characteristic. Nothing was known about the way in which infections got into wounds. It was thought that miasmas or bad airs could come up from the river or come out of the walls of buildings, and they were seriously thinking of moving the general to another site so that it would get away from the bad air. And then quite suddenly, later in the 19th century, round about the 1870s, the next pioneer, Lord Lister, using the work of Pasteur, showed that if there were no germs, there was no infection. We have a beautiful picture of a theatre at the General Hospital with an open fireplace, a step-ladder propped up in a corner, the kind of jugs and ewers and basins that you would find in Victorian bedrooms, and the operating table is just an ordinary scrubbed kitchen table. What did the surgeons wear at that time? Well, they didn't want to wear the clothes that they were then going to use to visit their patients at home. They would come into the operating theatre, put on an old frock coat that they didn't want to use for ordinary everyday activities. They would obviously be splattered with the blood and the other material from patients, and so these frock coats gradually became stained and stiffened, and the comment of the day was that you could tell how experienced a surgeon was by how stained and stiff his operating garments were.
But gradually, the idea of sterilisation became commonplace. The carbolic spray was the first step towards an antiseptic environment, and it was soon realised that the operating team themselves must also be germ-free before it was safe to proceed. White gowns soon replaced the dirty frock coats. And around that time, in the late 1890s, the hospital dentist, Dr. Blandy, introduced another aid for the surgeon, the magic X-ray tube, which had only just been invented. By making patients lie still for 20 minutes, Dr. Blandy could photograph broken bones, kidney stones, and other foreign bodies hidden to the naked eye, making it possible for the surgeon to know exactly where to operate. But despite all these technical advances for medicine, hospital patient care began at the bedside.
The resident apothecary in the 1850s, a very far-sighted man called Sibson, sent to the Institute of Nursing Sisters in London for a superintendent nurse. And so the 1850s, this was round about the time of Florence Nightingale's triumphant return from the Crimean War, the setting up of nurse training schools, the beginning of the idea that there was a true profession, there was a skill which respectable girls could and should learn for the benefit of the patients. This idea began to catch hold. And so from that time onwards until, in my view, round about the end of the 1939-45 war, nursing was on the constant up and up.
In those days, nursing was an honoured profession. In fact, we came under a sort of challenge. Most people said, "Who are you going to be a nurse? You'll never stick it," including one's parents. "No daughter of mine shall be a nurse," said my father.
But she was. Sister Molly Denman arrived at the General in 1925 and worked there till her retirement, by which time the hospital had become part of the National Health Service.
Now it would appear to be more of a thing with a career structure, work to which people go, do their stint and go home again. There one went to be a nurse. So one lived in the hospital and accepted all its rules, which were quite severe, but it trained us in endurance and a certain amount of perhaps unintelligent obedience in a way, and yet we got through the years of training, and I think it did breed in us a sort of discipline which otherwise we would not have had.
Before the Second World War, nursing was much more labour-intensive, for without antibiotics, even a simple hernia operation required weeks confined to bed, with nurses tending to your every need. Yet standards were high, even though boiling was the only known means of sterilisation, and a nurse would be thoroughly ashamed if a patient caught an infection after an operation. Peggy Jepson, who worked through the 30s, still remembers how they dealt with an epidemic of pneumonia in the pre-antibiotic days.
In a bad winter, we would have a run of pneumonias, and we used to say that a third of them would recover anyway. A third of them would die anyway. And the middle third, it would depend entirely upon the nursing care as to whether they recovered or died. And if you think of a patient with a temperature of 104, absolutely wildly demented, who's jumped out of a bedroom window at home, and picture yourself as a nurse on night duty with a ward full of very sick people and this man to control in addition to everything else, you can get a sort of picture of the kind of work that you had to do when you were on a medical ward in the winter. This particular person I'm thinking of did in fact recover, and fortunately took a fancy to the two nurses who were on duty when he was admitted, and so was prepared to stay in bed and do as he was told.
Yet in the course of their work, despite all the long, hard hours, they did manage to enjoy themselves.
I remember causing great hilarity on James Foreman ward, because we were in a spell of very great urgency and emergency when we had lots of admissions and we were short of staff and there would be a flu crisis or something. And I was dashing around collecting washing bowls. And in those days we used to take a big bowl, an enamel bowl full of hot water, and a whole pile of bowls underneath it, and we'd dash round the ward and put a bowl onto each bed table. And then we'd go around and with the other bowl fill up each bowl so that every patient could have a little water to wash with. And I had a bowl full of dirty water and a whole pile of bowls underneath it. And I slipped on the polished floor, and of course we used to have to polish the floors too in those days. And they were highly polished, I can assure you. And I played football with the bowls. The dirty water went all over me, the bowls went all over the ward, and that did the patients more good than any medicine. They had a great laugh about it.
One night off a week was a nurse's lot in those days, and even then they had to have a pass if they were going to stay out after 10. Jean Sidey and Katie Wright remember how awkward it was for nurses and their boyfriends. Naturally, there was a total ban on men in the nurses' home, but the more athletic ones found a way round it.
I do remember them climbing in through the windows quite often and getting stuck in the windows. Oh, yes, they had to. You see, boyfriends were not allowed in the home at all, but then there were no male nurses in those days.
2:45 one morning, there was a knock on my door and a voice says, "It's all right, Ducky, it's me. There's a window rattling somewhere and I've been round all the doors and I think it's yours. Can I come and stick some paper in it?" This was Sister Sullivan. Well, she stuck paper in. Half an hour later she came back. She says, "Sorry to trouble you, Ducky, it's not your window." And she takes the paper out and shuts the window and goes to somebody else because she couldn't stand noise.
And that's how one sister tried to combat those late-night visitors. For sisters and matrons had absolute authority in those days, and a daily ward visit was like the commanding officer inspecting the troops.
They used to say, whenever I did a round, I straightened every curtain in every ward. You know, that sort of thing. You go around straightening up. But everybody looked forward to the matron's visit, really. I think it was a sad loss when they stopped going round.
We expected the matron, didn't we? That made our day, really. Well, they inspected everything. They went through the sluice and looked and used to lift up the lavatory seat and say, "It's round the ring that matters. That's where your infection comes from." But, I mean, we took that as help to us rather than something against us. You can't really compare those days to these days because it was nursing and it was our life, really.
And what did the doctors think of those formidable figures doing their ward rounds? John Sheehan was house surgeon in the 1930s when a matron really was a matron.
Oh, a very important person. Whenever one saw the matron walking down the main corridor of the hospital, she was really treated as royalty. Miss Little was the first matron I worked, a very precise and definite personality whose interest in the hospital was paramount, and I think she herself was most successful in getting people to contribute monies, etc., to the hospital.
Fundraising seems to have taken up a lot of the matron's time, and it was something of an art. For a start, you had to get to know the people with money, men like Sir Thomas Shipston, local brewer, whose benevolence ran to an entire operating theatre which was named after him. A generous man who Katie Wright remembers seemed to be unable to resist any opportunity to give his money away to a deserving cause.
Yes, well, he used to visit the hospital such a lot. He was very, very fond of the matron, and he was a gruff sort of, blunt sort of a man, but a very, very nice, a gentleman. And Miss Little said to me, will you take Sir Thomas up in the lift to so-and-so, to the theatre or wherever it was, and if he gives you a shilling, take it. He'll be hurt if you don't. So I took the shilling, happily. And when he took us all to his house for tea parties, when we were leaving, it was like a school treat. He used to give us an apple and an orange.
But despite the fact that the General Hospital is now part of the National Health Service, it relies more than ever on fundraising for the high-technology equipment that modern medicine needs. Even now, an appeal is being launched to find money for the latest laser equipment for surgery and the treatment of skin complaints.
If we're looking now at the rise of technology in medicine, this is something that concerns us all because of the cost of things like whole-body scanners, heart transplantation and so on. We've got to realise that in the middle of the 19th century, the people who were paying for things at the General Hospital were desperately concerned at the escalating cost of leeches. In the middle of the 19th century, the General Hospital used 20,000 leeches in 1 year, and if you reflect that they only had something like 120 beds, then you can imagine how many leeches were applied to each patient.
Thankfully, those days have gone. Today, hospital treatment is becoming more and more scientific, and in its 200-year history, the General has always been quick to adapt to the latest advances, and if it needed more space, it simply added another wing, and might have gone on doing so if it hadn't been for the arrival of that purpose-built symbol of progress, the Queen's Medical Centre at the university.
When you look at the General Hospital, you may wonder why the new university hospital was built when perhaps we could have altered and added to the General Hospital. The answer, strange though it seems, is that the General Hospital was never a completely general hospital. Families needed to be separated sometimes. If there was a road traffic accident, the children had to go to the Children's Hospital, the adults were brought to the General Hospital. If there were injuries, if there were eye injuries, they were dealt with in one place. If now opinions were needed from colleagues, they could be scattered around among the Nottingham hospitals. And so what was necessary, particularly with the development of the medical school, was to have a truly general hospital here on the University Hospital site and to develop the City Hospital so that these two institutions could be truly general and the old General Hospital could support them in providing facilities which they lacked.
It's a much more personal hospital. The odd corridors and things remain in your mind, but in the Queen's Medical Centre, the wide, huge corridors are overpowering.
Big is not beautiful. I don't think they'll build any more of these enormous hospitals.
General Hospital, it gave me a happy life, albeit a hard-working one. And why should I not love the old place with all its memories? Even though, like an old retired racehorse, it is now being put out to grass while the young one gets on with it.
Oh, I think there'll always be a place for the Nottingham General Hospital. I think it should continue forever. I really do.
Hello, General.
Far away, thank you. General Hospital.
Do you know which ward? One moment.
X-ray, thank you.
General.
General Hospital. Physiotherapy, thank you.